Hi, welcome to a study in verse brought to you by the good people at the Streetlight Guild. We'll be doing a deep dive into Langston Hughes's poem "I Too," talking about why I like the poem personally, why I think it works, why I think it's a very relevant and timely poem even today. So, without further ado, let's kind of jump into this and get started. I'll share my screen with you so we can kind of go through some of the notes and the ideas behind all of this. Um, so here we go. So to begin with, I'm Sidney Jones Jr., and I'll be your guide through this poem. A little bit about me just to get us acquainted in case you've never met me or you've never been to one of the other two versions of this. I'm a teacher, high school English teacher with Columbus Alternative High School in Columbus, Ohio. Um, Other than that, I'm a pretty big Langston Hughes fan. I'm not a true academic Langston Hughes scholar, but I do teach his poetry and I do enjoy reading his poetry and kind of dissecting it. And I Too by Hughes is one of my all-time favorite poems. So before we do this, let's first do a experiment. Um, this normally works better in person, so I don't know how this is going to work via Zoom. So I'm going to trust you somewhere uh, across the ether of the internet to kind of do this and see what you come up with. So if you have access to some paper, some scratch paper, um, jot down these following words: America, brother, kitchen, table, sing, and tomorrow. And for each word, come up with at least two images or emotions or ideas that you associate with your word. So it's like a basic word association. So take some time, do that. And after you kind of come up with your ideas, come up with your thoughts, your emotions, whatever you conceive of when you think of these words, put that aside for now. We'll try to come back to that sometime later in the process of doing all of this. So let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about Langston Hughes first, the poet, who he was, a little bit about his life, what influenced him, and some of the critics and criticisms of his work, and even him as an artist. First thing, he was born in Joplin, Missouri, 1902. His official name is James Mercer Langston Hughes. He was born to Carrie M. Langston and James Hughes. His parents later shortly separated after he was born. And he was raised primarily by his maternal grandmother until he was around 13 years old. His maternal grandmother, just a little bit of information about her and some of his other family members that are kind of important. She was a very interesting character, and you can kind of get a sense of where Langston got some of his spirit and I guess ideas a little bit later from. His maternal grandmother, Mary Leary Langston, was from North Carolina originally. She was the daughter of an enslaved person, but she herself was a free Black woman. She was actually educated and graduated from Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, um, right around, I think, the early 1800s, uh, which is, pretty phenomenal when you think about it for the time period. Her first husband, who was not Langston's grandfather, was actually an abolitionist who was killed in the raid on Harper's Ferry with John Brown. Then later she remarried and married Charles Langston, who was Langston Hughes' grandfather. They ended up moving to Kansas, where post Reconstruction, both of them were kind of very active in um, public life. And I think Charles Langston was actually a politician of sorts in the Reconstruction, post Reconstruction Kansas. So that's a little bit about where he comes from on his maternal side. His paternal side, his father, James Nathaniel Langston, born in Indiana, but is the um, offspring of enslaved people from Kentucky. And in fact, his paternal grandfather um, was a slave trader, a Jewish slave trader in Kentucky. And his father later left Kentucky, um, married his mother, but later left his mother and went to Mexico, disillusioned by being a black man in America at that time period, and thought he can have a better life, better sense of freedom, so to speak, living in Mexico. So, but we'll get more about his father a little bit later, because I think that's also something that that whole relationship between James Langston uh, Hughes and James N. Hughes shaped the poet as well. Langston Hughes was a class poet who was in an elementary school, somewhere around eighth grade. And he moved around a lot in his early life, from Missouri, where he was born, to Kansas, where he lived with his grandmother, to Illinois, where he moved after his grandmother died, and he moved back to live with his mother and his stepfather. And then eventually to Ohio, where he graduated from high school in Cleveland, Ohio. Some of his early influences were the poetry of American poets Carl Sandburg, who he experienced the reading of Carl Sandburg and studying Carl Sandburg in high school, which is the time when Langston Hughes started to like really get into writing poetry seriously. He was also influenced by Paul Laurence Dunbar, the Black poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, and also Walt Whitman, who, when you look at Langston Hughes' life and you look at the life of Walt Whitman kind of side by side, there are some similarities in kind of their travels and other things as well. More about that later too. Um, Back to his father. So tensions with his father primarily resulted from, other than his father leaving his mother and the family when he moved to Mexico. Um, Tensions further with his father was when Langston Hughes began college right around 1921. He wanted to be a writer and wanted to write poetry. And his father didn't want him to do that. His father was, wanted him to be something such as like an engineer or some other type of profession that he thought he could really support himself. And so there was this tension between what Langston wanted to do and what his father wanted him to do. That kind of was a rift between them. Another thing that Langston Hughes was another influence on him was his discovery of Harlem when he started college at Columbia University. And by discovery of Harlem, I mean like discovery of the life, the freedom, the party and atmosphere, so to speak, of everything that Harlem was in the early 1920s, right around the height of the Harlem Renaissance. You know, that excitement, that energy, that electricity at that time period was, I guess you can say, something of a distraction to the student that Langston Hughes was at the time. So he never actually finished college from Columbia University. He does leave Columbia, and he takes many jobs, such as being a truck farmer, such as being a busboy, a cook, a waiter, sailor. I think he works for a time in DC, Washington, D.C. He does re-enroll in school at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, and he eventually graduates in 1929. Post-graduation, he does a lot of traveling, goes to places such as Mexico, Spain, France, West Africa, the Canary Islands, and the Soviet Union. Langston Hughes is best known, arguably, as perhaps the best African American or Black poet. And at the time, during his life, he was kind of unofficially known as the Negro Poet Laureate. But you can also look at some of his criticisms and argue that he's also the most abused poet of his era. So let's take a look at what some people said or wrote about Langston Hughes, the poet, and his writings. One headline from upon the publication of his first uh, body of work, The Weary Blues, Langston Hughes has given us a first book that makes the opening of a career well worth watching. This is written by DeBose Hayward of the New York Herald, 1926. Obvious praise for Langston Hughes' first book, The Weary Blues. Compare that to what happens upon the publication of his next book, Fine Clothes to the Jew. Langston Hughes' book of poems, Trash, and that is from the Philadelphia Courier of 1927. Obviously, you can kind of see this was not well received, a not well received book, poetry by Langston Hughes. Many believe because during this book, he kind of does more experimentation with his style and maybe a little bit more of his subject matter. Coincidentally, this book now gets higher praise than it did during his first publication. James Baldwin wrote in 1959 in the New York Times, "Every time I read Langston Hughes, I am amazed all over again by his genuine gifts and depressed that he has done so little with them." So if you know anything about James Baldwin, you know that he pulls no punches in his writing or his opinions about people and things. And while Baldwin was impressed by Langston Hughes and admired him as a poet, he was also very critical of him. Primarily, some believe because he didn't think Langston Hughes went far enough or did enough with his poetry to kind of push for the advancement of Black people or to demand more in his writing and his poetry. There's also some debate, and I've read some other things where, as you know, James Baldwin was a not only outspoken Black person, but also very outspoken and out with his sexuality, being a gay man at the time, which was obviously not something that was very popular to come out and be during his time period. And Langston Hughes, who is believed to have been, by many accounts, also a gay Black man at the time, but he was never really out with his sexuality. Some believe this is also another reason why Baldwin was kind of critical of Langston Hughes, and that Langston Hughes was not living and being as authentic as maybe he thought that he could have or should have been. Another more later critique of Langston Hughes comes from Lawrence Lieberman, and this is from 1968, where he writes, "We are tempted to ask, what are Hughes' politics? And if he has none, why not? The age demands intellectual commitment from its spokesman." So think about it, 1968, Lieberman, this is the height of the civil rights era. This is the time of high political activism. And Lieberman is expecting, again, more from Langston Hughes. You get this sense from this excerpt of his critique that he doesn't think Hughes expresses his political beliefs strongly enough or nearly enough through his writing or through his works. A little bit of defense from Langston Hughes himself, the way he defended himself, because one of the criticism that was often heaped upon him was about his style of writing, and that his writing was not as advanced or using enough of the higher language, if you will. So Langston Hughes himself responds to some of his critics this way: "I didn't know the upper class Negroes well enough to write about them. I knew only the people I had grown up with, and they weren't people whose shoes were always shined, who had been to Harvard or who had heard of Bach, but they seemed to me to be good people too." So his thing was, I write about what I know, I write about who I know, and I write about them in the language that I know and the language that they knew. He was not trying to, I guess, write about these common Black people with language that was not authentic to them or authentic to him. So his claim was, I'm writing as authentically as I know how to write. So let's talk about the poem, I Too, and let's talk about how and why I think the poem works on many levels. So first thing, some quick notes. The poem was first published in 1925. The recording that we'll listen to comes from 1955. We'll talk about that recording in a second. It is a very brief poem, only 62 words. And so, it's quick. And the recording of it, when you hear this recording of Langston Hughes reading it, he does it, I think, in less than a minute. Um, and it uses first person narrator, first person pronouns. You will notice the use of I and me several times throughout the poem. And it sounds very conversational, right? And I think the reason why it is so conversational, if you want to kind of look at some of the poetic structure that he uses, is a very balanced structure. Balance meaning he does some obvious repetition, some of the words like I too. If you notice how he begins, I too sing America, and at the end, I too am America. So that parallel structure. Also, the way the lines are, they're not long, and they're all pretty much in stopped or in jam. There's kind of a mixture of in stop, meaning the lines end with sometimes end with a closing punctuation mark, like a period, or um, sometimes he does this break here at the end after ashamed with a dash. But a lot of times he gives you like a definite end to the line, or sometimes he has what's called an end jam line, where there's no ending punctuation, but the idea and the thought kind of runs on to the next line. So when you read it and you hear him read it, it sounds very conversational. It sounds as though it's someone just speaking or talking to you, as opposed to someone writing or reciting a very formally written poem. Another idea that he uses here in the writing of this is he gives us closed stanzas. Closed stanzas meaning the stanzas are going to end with again, concluding punctuation mark, almost as though each stanza could be its own idea. So let's try to hear it first, and then we'll talk about a little bit about this recording. All right. So if you have read the poem before, or if you are looking at the poem now as it's written, and the way it was published, if you pay attention to how he recorded this, and this is a recording from 1955, I think this is actually from an album of recorded poetry that he did. If you notice, he does one change. He changes it from its original in the second to last stanza, second line, second last stanza, where he says, "They'll see how beautiful I am." In a recording in 1955, he changes it to, "They'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed." And so I don't have any direct notes about why he made that change, but that's something that you can ponder about and discuss. Um, Possibly because of the time period. This is 1955. This is still pre-civil rights, but a lot of the energy and the seeds of the civil rights movement are definitely um, being sown and growing, and that sentiment is growing for much further in 1955 than probably even 1925, near the end of the Harlem Renaissance era. It's also possible that this reflects, this change when he reads it reflects his thoughts and where he is at that time in 1955. Um, which you could argue, going back to what Lieberman said about Langston Hughes' politics, you can argue that he does make some political statements. He does kind of give you a strong sense of where he is politically, maybe not as strongly as people like Mr. Lieberman would have wanted, but even something as subtle as changing the phrase "I am" to "we are" in this poem, I think, could speak to what he believes politically. So let's go back to what I asked you to do earlier, and I want you to think about the words America and brother and kitchen and table and sing and I think tomorrow. So another thing that I think makes this poem work, other than the 62 words and how conversational it sounds, is that what Langston Hughes does, he uses simple language and he does the thing that poetry professors or creative writing professors probably cringe at the most, in the idea that, the cliche of show not tell, right? You can argue that he does more telling than showing in this poem, but you can also argue that with very particular words, such as the words I asked you to kind of think about, he's drawing upon some of the subconscious ideas or thoughts that we have within us about certain things. So if you take, for instance, America, and I have no idea of knowing what you would have written or said um, across the internet about this, but some ideas come to mind with America. People may think patriotism, or they may think flawed, or they may think images such as the American flag or the Statue of Liberty, or freedom or democracy, right? Or the idea of brother. The brother, you may think of, patriot. Sorry, being like a family or a protector, protection, some sort of person you have a connection with. Um, Kitchen, you may think of food or nourishment. You may think of warmth. Um, you may think of cooking. Table, what comes to mind could be communion or the sharing, again, food. Um, or you may think very particular foods like bread or meals, or Thanksgiving, if you think of Thanksgiving as being this, again, large feast of communion and sharing of food. The word like sing may bring into mind ideas of um, participation, like singing in a choir, or talent, or voice, or some sort of vocal ability. You think of tomorrow, you may think of hope, you may think of dreams, you may think of optimism, you may think of the idea that it's going to be better, right? So I believe uses words like this, even though they're not the most specific words that you can use when in poetry to like plant a very particular or specific image in the minds of the reader. But maybe that's not his point. Maybe what he was trying to do was tap into the things that maybe all of us kind of go to or think about when we hear words like those. And so again, the simplicity of the language leads a lot to interpretation, but I think it's interpretation that we can all kind of come together on certain things on. So earlier we talked about how one of Langston Hughes' influences was the poet Walt Whitman. And I said that, when you think about their lives together, you can kind of draw some parallels. For instance, how Whitman, writes in free verse. Some argue he is the architect of American free verse. And Langston Hughes writes in free verse some. But you can definitely see their comparisons when you think about what he wrote with I Too in 1925. Compare that to what Walt Whitman wrote in 1860 with I Hear America Singing. And you could argue, you can kind of see that Langston Hughes' I Too ends up being kind of a response, or maybe even a 1925 Black version of Whitman's I Hear America Singing. Whereas Whitman talks about such professions, such people as mechanics and carpenters or boatmen or deckhands or shoemakers, and how they're all singing, like singing praise for the freedom of their jobs and their occupation and the life that they're living, the energy that they're living with in 1860. One obvious scan of this poem, you can see who's being left out, and that is Black people. In 1860, Black people would have been enslaved. So Whitman's not writing about hearing the songs of enslaved people as they're singing, or celebrating. He's not celebrating their occupation or their lives, if you will. In his poem, he is kind of giving us this very upbeat, positive, very white version of America in 1860. And you go back to what Langston Hughes writes in I2, you notice he also uses the word sing here, but he gives us a very focused perspective on what is believed to be a Black person with darker brother here. And we'll kind of get into more of the association with darker brother in a second. So there's kind of a definite connection between Hughes and Whitman just by looking at how this poem in particular kind of connects them, and that the similarity in what Hughes is doing compared to what Whitman did in 1860. So let's talk more about why I think this works, and let's focus on a little bit of the word choice with the verbs and the tone that Langston Hughes uses. So what I did here is I kind of just highlighted all of the verbs that you see being used in I2. Kind of just whited out all of the other words. Got this idea from one of my students who once tried to fool me with his word count by whiting out the unnecessary words to kind of boost his word count, so to speak. So you'll see him use action verbs 11 times. Verbs like sing or comes or laugh or eat or grow, right? So it gives you that strong sense of action. You'll see him use state of being verbs 5 times, am or be or will be in the future tense. You see him use present tense verbs 12 times, right? So that tells you something too, and that mostly this poem is read and felt in the present tense. So when you see sing, or you see am, or you see come, or you see laugh, or eat, or grow, all of this kind of gives you an immediate sense of the poem. So it's mostly in its present tense sense. And then you see him use the future tense or allude to the future tense 3 times. Will be, nobody will dare, they will see. So he alludes to this 3 times, and this future tense, which some could argue, is this very hopeful sound, but that's only 3 times he uses this. So just looking at your verbs gives you a sense of what he's trying to convey, and maybe the tone that he's trying to convey as well. Verbs like the word sing. Sing gives you this sense of participating. I too sing America. I will participate in America. Also gives you a sense of boldness a couple times. Things like nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then, right? So it's very bold tone in that case. And further look at this, if you want to look at what Hughes does with his modifiers and his imagery, 3 distinct adjectives that he uses, and 7 distinct adverbs. Adverbs typically are looked at as kind of, if you're a poet or you're a writer, I think Stephen King was the one of the writers who wrote that you shouldn't use as many adverbs. They're your weak descriptors. He ends up using more adverbs than he does actual adjectives in the poem, like words like I too. Too is your adverb here, but you have darker brother. That's your adjective. Eat well, well is your adverb. Grow strong, strong is your adverb. Tomorrow, since in this case is an adverb. So he uses, you can argue, some weak descriptors, but as I wrote here, the onus is on the reader's imagination. Back to that experiment we did when I asked you to think about the words, right? He's using words like America or brother that are not the most descriptive, but they're putting the onus on you as the reader to, in your imagination, create the association with those words. Maybe the assumption here is that there is this collective Black understanding about certain experiences, such as, what it's like to be the darker brother. What is it like to be a Black person in America? And so this is that association that maybe used is kind of drawing upon is something from the Black collective consciousness, if you will. So if you want to look at this poem through a more contemporary lens, critical race theory, this poem works even if you look at it in that level. So one of the aspects of critical race theory is known as the voice of color thesis, which is pretty much this idea that Black people or the experts in telling their own story. No one can tell your story better than you can. No one can talk about the experiences of being Black in America better than a Black person in America. So the whole poem is told from this perspective of a Black person and kind of gets into that voice of color thesis, in that it is giving us this perspective of what it's like to be this darker brother who is left out or treated as an outcast, kicked aside, if you will, told to eat in the kitchen when company comes, and what it's like to be that person. Another aspect of critical race theory that the poem plays upon is the idea that racism is not this extraordinary event, but it's a common, pervasive, and ordinary event in American society. To look at that, check out stanza 2. I am the darker brother to send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. Eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. So just looking at that second stanza, this idea of how Black people were treated. And a couple things about this stanza. One common interpretation is you can read into this as the darker brother being not only a Black person, but maybe an enslaved person who, like, during that era, whenever company came, they may be sent elsewhere. You don't eat with company, you go into the kitchen or you go elsewhere. Or this idea that this darker brother is a Black man in America, a Black person in America who is going to be pushed aside or sent elsewhere when company comes. Company, you can look at it in a couple of different ways. If we're talking about America, company could be other countries, other era, other nations. And when America is faced with critique from maybe other nations about, especially at that time, how it treated Black people, maybe this idea that, they would kind of send them elsewhere or ignore that and put on this brave face or this more perfect face, like, oh, we don't have any problems. So maybe in that case, that also kind of paints a picture of what America was and what America is now in a larger sense. This idea that racism is not this extraordinary event, but it's something that happens every day. Another aspect of critical race theory, the idea that whiteness is property or whiteness is a privilege, and the idea of the right to exclusion and the right to ownership. Stanza 2 and also stanza 3 speaks to that. Tomorrow I'll be at the table and company comes. Nobody dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. This idea that Black people were at one time owned and at one time treated as property. You get a sense of that alluded to in stanzas 2 and stanza 3 by the fact that, they were told and expected to go elsewhere when company comes, or they're expected to, just deal with and take the treatment that white people were giving them at that time in America. This idea that they could be excluded is spoken to and hinted to in stanzas 2 and stanza 3. One last aspect of critical race theory that this poem speaks to is a critique of liberalism, or a refuting of the idea of color blindness. The idea that people say, "Oh, I don't see color. See everyone as being the same." And I think he speaks to this in stanza 4, where he writes, "Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed." Um, and the idea of colorblindness is arguably, in a sense, a type of racism, in that you're refusing to see what is the most obvious aspect of a person, and a important part of who they are, an important part of their culture. And so when Langston Hughes writes, "They'll see how beautiful I am. They'll see me as Black. They'll see me as beautiful and be ashamed for not seeing me all before, not recognizing me before, not treating me as I am, and be ashamed of that." So the way that critical race theory looks at this in a contemporary sense, this poem still has a lot of relevance, and still speaks to a lot of the problems that America faces currently. So let's talk more about how the poem speaks to us today in a little bit more detail. I too sing America, I too am America. And at the time when I first did this presentation, this was obviously pre-COVID-19, and pre all of the other things that's happened in America since, all the other protests and outrage against, like, the killings of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery. So I wrote this, kind of put this together at a time when we were still dealing with what was going on with Colin Kaepernick, and the idea of the Me Too movement, and still Black Lives Matter movement. But all of these movements that are happening now still kind of echo the sentiment of what Langston Hughes was writing about. The idea that I meaning Black people, or in this case, Black people, we participate in America. We are America, right? We are not excluded from this country. We built this country. And that's one of the primary things that the Black Lives Matter movement is wanting people to recognize. Black Lives Matter. Black lives are a part of America. Even the Me Too movement, this idea that women's voices should not be ignored. Women's voices deserve to be heard and should be heard. They are a part of this American fabric as well, and they deserve to be heard and deserve to be considered as a part of the American fabric as well. So these ideas that you see in here around us today, you still see, when you think about it, echoed in what Langston Hughes wrote in 1925. I am the darker brother, the send me to eat in the kitchen. This idea of the darker brother, although popularly interpreted as being just Black people, another way to think about that is darker brother as being the, so to speak, Black sheep of the family, the person in a family, the person in a group that is ignored or treated as other, and it's often sometimes sent to the kitchen or regarded as being elsewhere or being excluded. And that you see that take place in current American society in a lot of different ways. The darker brother, could still be Black people, in the idea of how Black people are sent elsewhere or kicked out, so to speak. If you think about what's going on with gentrification in a lot of our urban areas, property, land is being, taken away, and Black people are being sent elsewhere, or have to go elsewhere. Or the darker brother could be immigrants, people who are either not, uh, in this case, in contemporary American society, not allowed into the country or being dissuaded from being a part of America, or in some cases being kicked out of America. The darker brother could be members of the LGBTQ um, communities, where they are, regarded as other and not really being allowed to take a part in or have a place at the American table, but being sent elsewhere or being treated as they are other. And so this idea of the darker brother speaks, especially in today's society, to um, issues even larger than just race. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Um, and like one of the things that I think is very fascinating is Black Twitter. And for my non-Black people listening to this, there's no real Black Twitter as being a separate Twitter entity, but I'm talking about how Black people interact on Twitter, and how, especially how there can be a very serious or um, non-humorous occurrence, but Black Twitter and Black people, we're going to find the humor in it. We're going to laugh. We're going to find something. We're going to carve out some joy, and but use that as a way of building ourselves up, eating well, and growing strong, right? And that tends to happen a lot of the times when there might be something serious, such as, I don't know how long ago this was now, but way back when Kanye West made his statement about slavery being a choice, and some of the responses, some of the tweets that Black people had, and kind of poking fun at that and dissecting that and finding the humor, but still also kind of building up of self through that. And so this idea that responding to these serious incidents or these serious occurrences, finding the humor, finding a way to kind of um, nourish yourself, just a sec, is something that you see happening even now. And that's something that Langston Hughes wrote about and spoke about in his poem, I Too. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. So there's been a lot of discussion, especially recently, um, about where Black people are statistically um, in America. There's been a lot of examination of the poverty rates or the literacy rates, or all the Black demographics, which obviously um, it's very negative in the sense of where we are as far as socioeconomically, where we are statistically in terms of like economics. Of course, a lot of this, you hear these discussions in, especially now, in terms of like reparations and how to best um, advance Black America in these, in economic or educational ways. And so tomorrow, Langston Hughes is writing about tomorrow possibly being like, from 1925, this idea of the future and this idea of, tomorrow you'll be at the table. Tomorrow you'll be allowed to really participate, or you will participate in America and be at the table with other people. And I remember having this discussion on the same poem, I think several months ago, talking to the people who were having this like interaction about I Too. And someone brought up a point that maybe tomorrow, today, we need to like build our own table. It's not enough to just say, hey, I'll be at the table, but maybe tomorrow, meaning today, it's time for us to make our own table. Instead of waiting for a place at the table that we made for us, let's make our own table. But you kind of see that this could be the sense of where we are now in America. This idea that making tomorrow now. What does it take to to take this hope of tomorrow and make that manifested in a more present tense as opposed to a future tense. Nobody dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. And I'm going to focus in on the word dare again, because I think one of the things you see happening in a contemporary sense, especially through the more contemporary um, protest that's been happening, is this very bold sense of resistance that especially the Black youth and the youth as a whole, I think, is demonstrating, right? This idea that, you're not going to dare send us to the kitchen. You're not going to dare ignore us. You're going to hear what we have to say. You're going to see us. We're going to be present in your face. So this bold sense of resistance that maybe Langston Hughes was inferring in his poem is another aspect that is being manifested in today's society. Lastly, when he writes, besides they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I think this is interesting because, America, I think, goes through these stages where as a whole, it's really cool to be Black, right? As far as not from a Black person sense, but just from the general white American sense, where they recognize or seem to recognize the beauty of Black culture, or the positive aspects of Blackness. And you see that in stages, I think, and in cycles. You saw the response to Black Panther. You see the response to just Black people being positive at times. Of course, it takes sometimes Black people making that happen. But this idea that Langston Hughes is writing, that besides you'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed, that's again, he's writing this in his view of his hopeful view of tomorrow and what he thinks America could and maybe should eventually come to this realization. Have we gotten there all the way yet? Probably not. But again, as you can kind of see through the protests and the movements and the energy that's currently happening, I think this is also something that is being pushed for, right? And being kind of aimed for, is to kind of make America really see us as Black people. So here's some of my resources. I realized in the original presentation of this, I didn't cite my sources, which is shame on me as being an English teacher. But this is kind of where I dipped my toe in to kind of get some information to kind of craft all of this information about the poem I Too by Langston Hughes. So I'll kind of leave this up a little bit, let you kind of take a look at that. And again, I think the poem is it's not only well written in its simplicity, but it's also highly relevant, and it stands the test of time in that sense, in the sense that you can dissect it and look at it and kind of get a sense of the author and when he wrote it and what was happening around the time he was writing it, but also that you can take a lot of what he's saying and apply it to today, which is good, and probably also in a sense unfortunate in that we're still fighting those same fights and battling against the same things that people of Langston Hughes era was also fighting against. But in a way, maybe that also is ammunition for us as we go forward. So let me know what you think. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments, any of the ideas. Again, I am a fan of Langston Hughes. I'm an English teacher. I am not the most academic Langston Hughes scholar, but there may be some things I didn't see, or some things that you see, or that you kind of are thinking about as you're viewing this. Feel free to shoot me your ideas, or if you want to just have some further dialogue and conversation about this. There's my email. Drop me a line. Let me know what you think. and I'll be glad to interact with you. Hopefully, this has been some good time spent via the internet, and I hope to hear from you guys. Take care.